In any event, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And as Professor Peterson just said, the book is just out in paperback, so my daughters were very excited by this sizzling page-turner comment, and my husband said, life must be very boring in West Australia. But it is a pleasure to be here, especially at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, because I'm actually really interested in climate solutions. But one of the things I'm also interested in is why has it been so hard for us to even have a conversation about solutions, particularly in the United States, and particularly given what we know from history about how long we've known that climate change from greenhouse gases could be a problem. And part of the answer to that story is that it's been difficult for us to have a conversation about solutions because there are a significant number of people who refuse to admit that we even have a problem. So my talk tonight is really about those people who refuse to admit we have a problem, how they tried to persuade the rest of us that we didn't in fact have a problem, and why they did what they did. So, sorry. Yeah, well, we're trying, but we're having there's technical support. I mean, it's turned on. I've done what I can. I don't think it's moving. It is? Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, we have it now? All right. They woke up in the back. So a few years ago, my Austrian governor, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, announced California's commitment to the Western Climate Initiative. And when he announced the commitment of the state of California to commit to Kyoto-level cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, he said, I say the debate is over. We know the science, we see the threat, and we know the time for action is now. Well, it's not every day you get to agree with a politician, but I thought my governor was correct. And indeed, around that time, in the mid-2000s, it seemed that the American people mostly agreed. A poll done by the Gallup polling organization in 2007 showed that 72% of American citizens were completely or mostly convinced that global warming was underway. Indeed, 62% of my fellow Americans believed that life on Earth would continue without major disruption only if society took immediate and drastic action to reduce global warming. And at that time, even many former contrarians had come around. So, for example, one of them in the United States was Frank Luntz, the Republican strategist, who in 2006 in an interview said, it's now 2006. So he was off to a good start. He got the year right. I think most people would conclude there is global warming taking place and that the behavior of humans is affecting the climate. Now, Luntz was important. He was famous, some might say infamous, because he was the author of a memo written to Republican candidates running for public office in the United States, in which he advised Republican candidates to use the phrase climate change rather than global warming, because he wrote, climate change is a lot less frightening. He argued that Republicans were vulnerable on environmental issues because opinion polls consistently showed that the American people did want the government to protect the environment, but that they believed that Democrats were more likely to protect the environment than Republicans. And so he advised Republicans that in order to win the global warming debate, that what they needed to do was to emphasize the scientific uncertainty and to insist that there was no consensus in the scientific community on the question. So he wrote, and all of the emphasis here is his own, the scientific debate remains open. Voters believe that there is no consensus within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. Now, was Luntz's position factually correct? Was there no consensus in the scientific community? No. In fact, the opposite was true. In 2001, so 5 years before his personal conversion, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's leading organization of expert scientific researchers who work on the topic, had said unequivocally that human activities are modifying the concentration of atmospheric constituents that absorb or scatter radiant energy. Most of the observed warming over the last 50 years is likely to have been due to the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. So that was in 2001 in the third assessment report, but in fact the scientific community had been articulating this even earlier. In the second assessment report of the IPCC, published in 1995, the scientists had concluded that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human impact on global climate. So we see evidence of a scientific consensus actually already emerging in the early to mid-1990s. My own historical analysis of the published scientific literature, of articles published in peer-reviewed, refereed journals by climate scientists showed that, in fact, scientists had an expert consensus on the reality of human-caused climate change by the early 1990s. Now, this result surprised many people, but it really should not have. One of the other quotes we have at the front of the book next to the Lyndon Johnson quote is Adlai Stevenson, who says, "The problem with Americans is that they haven't read the minutes of the previous meeting." And that's certainly the case here. In the United States, we seem to have forgotten that the United States, along with Canada and 191 other countries, is a signatory to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which committed the world's nations to taking action to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. And when our first President Bush, President George H.W. Bush, signed the Framework Convention, he called on world leaders to translate the written document into concrete action to protect the planet. So what happened? Why didn't we take those concrete steps that President Bush promised us? So my talk today is an attempt to answer that question, to answer why, 46 years after Lyndon Johnson, nearly 19 years after the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we still in the United States have taken no concrete steps as a nation to address the problem of anthropogenic global warming. So what I'd like to do tonight is to give you a super brief history of the evolution of climate science, just to help you understand in a very general way how scientists have come to know what they believe they do know today, and then tell you the story of the emergence of a political challenge to that scientific knowledge. It's a story of selling scientific uncertainty, along the lines of the Luntz memo, of emphasizing doubt, and motivated by a doctrinaire belief in free markets, born and hardened in the Cold War. So as a historian, you always have to find some place to start your story, and in this case we have a rather convenient one, which is the work of John Tyndall, who was the person who first established the concept of what it meant for something to be a greenhouse gas. In a series of experiments in the 1850s, Tyndall showed that certain gases, most notably water vapor and carbon dioxide, have a distinctive property of being highly transparent to visible light, but relatively opaque to infrared. So light from the sun easily penetrates the Earth's atmosphere, but heat re-radiated back to space tends to get trapped. And Tyndall recognized that, by and large, this was a good thing because without water vapor and carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, the Earth would be as cold as the moon and completely inhospitable for life. About 50 years later, Svante Arrhenius, the Swedish geochemist, recognized that when you burn fossil fuels, it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And therefore, using fossil fuels like coal to heat your homes or run your factories could cause the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to increase, and this could change the radiative balance of the planet. It could make the planet warmer. Arrhenius did the first scientific calculations of what a doubling of atmospheric carbon dioxide would do, and concluded that it could increase, or would increase, the average temperature of the globe between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. Now, Arrhenius was Swedish, so he thought global warming would be a good thing. The first person to suggest that there might be too much of a good thing was a British steam engineer, Guy Stewart Callendar, who in the 1930s, in 1938, published the first scientific article in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society, in which he argued, based on existing data, that carbon dioxide was, in fact, beginning to increase in the atmosphere, and indeed that the temperature might be starting to increase ever so slightly as well. Well, that was in 1938. As we know, war broke out in Europe the next year. Callendar went to work on war work for the Royal Air Force, and scientists didn't really come back to this question in a sustained way until the 1950s. Now, one of the major questions, though, that had been raised by Callendar's work had to do with the effect of water vapor. So we said that Tyndall recognized early on that water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. There's much more water vapor in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. Some skeptics raise this issue even today. And I pointed out even to show that many of the questions that skeptics raise are legitimate questions, except that they were actually answered 20, 30, 40, 50, in some cases even 100 years ago. So some people pointed out that since water vapor is such a strong greenhouse gas, that adding a little extra carbon dioxide might be unlikely to have any significant effect. This question was taken up in the 1950s by this man, Gilbert Plas, who was a pioneer in upper atmosphere spectroscopy and one of the first people to use satellite measurements to measure the content, the gas content of the atmosphere and the absorption bands of the gases in the atmosphere. And what Plas did was to resolve the absorption bands of water and carbon dioxide to a much greater degree than had previously been done, and to show that they did not, in fact, substantially overlap, that the water absorption band was close to some of the CO2 absorption, but actually not overlapping, and there were other absorption bands that were, in fact, quite far away. And so Plas concluded that Callendar was right, that warming from increased carbon dioxide was, in fact, very likely to occur. That work deeply influenced these two men, who were professors at my university, the University of California in San Diego, Hans Suess and Roger Revelle, two well-known oceanographers. In 1957, Revelle and Suess published a paper in the peer-reviewed journal Tellus, in which they argued that by burning fossil fuels stored in rocks over the course of hundreds of millions of years of geological time, that mankind was taking this stored repository of carbon dioxide and returning it to the atmosphere very quickly, in less than a century. And that by doing that, mankind was performing a great geophysical experiment, and not necessarily a good one. Not necessarily a bad one either. Revelle and Suess were actually a little bit on the fence about whether this was problematic or not, but they argued that it would be important to begin to study this in a serious scientific way. And above all, they argued that it would be important to begin to monitor carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in order to measure, first of all, whether or not CO2 was in fact increasing, because they knew it might be absorbed by the oceans or the biosphere, and if it was increasing, how much, and if it was increasing, what effect, if any, that was having on the Earth's climate. So that measurement of carbon dioxide became the life's work of this man, Charles David Keeling, who many of you have heard of as the author of the Keeling Curve. In 1958, Dave Keeling began what became his life's work, the systematic measurement of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere as part of the International Geophysical Year. Many years later, in the 1990s, Dave Keeling would win the National Medal of Science for this work, but already by 1965, Dave had concluded himself that his data did in fact show a detectable increase in carbon dioxide from about 315 parts per million when he began the measurement to about 320. So small, but detectable. And this fact, the fact that it was detectable, even in just 5 years, convinced him and Roger Revelle that this would likely become a serious policy issue in the fullness of time. And so in a report to the President's Science Advisory Committee, Revelle and Keeling wrote, by the year 2000, there will be about 25% more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere than at present, and this will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that marked changes in climate could occur. Now, some of you know that skeptics and contrarians like to claim, oh, scientists are always getting it wrong, they're hysterical, they're alarmist. But actually, if you look at the history of the warnings related to climate science, what you find is that scientists, in fact, got it right. And in fact, if anything, tended to be a little conservative. Because how much did the CO2 in the atmosphere increase by the year 2000? Anyone here know? There must be a scientist here who knows. Tom, you know, don't you? About 30 to 33%. So actually, their estimate was close, but a little on the low side. And this then led to the speech that Tom already mentioned, to Lyndon Johnson telling Congress in 1965 that we were changing the chemistry of the atmosphere. But of course, in 1965, President Johnson had a few other things to worry about, and this issue was far away. The year 2000 seemed like a long way away, and politicians in the audience, or anyone who here knows, it's a little hard to get politicians to worry even beyond the next electoral cycle, much less to worry about the next century. So not much serious interest was generated and sustained in policy circles at this time. But about 10 years later, that changed. During the 1960s and 70s, we saw the rise and development of climate modeling as a scientific activity. It was tied to the development of fast digital computers, which for the first time made it possible for scientists to build relatively realistic global circulation models or general circulation models to study the Earth's climate as a system and to model the dynamics of the atmosphere in a quasi-realistic way and to consider long-term trends such as what would happen to the atmosphere over the course of 10, 20, 50, 100 years. In other words, it was possible to revisit what came to be known as the Callendar question. And the state-of-the-art models that began to be built at this time confirmed Callendar's earlier result. In fact, confirmed Arrhenius's earlier result. That is to say that if you doubled the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, you would expect it to warm the planet by about 2 to 4 degrees. This conclusion was written up in a number of different reports, both in the United States, Canada, Japan, Europe, and elsewhere. Three important ones that got attention in the United States: a report edited by the director of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, Robert White, in 1977, a report for the U.S. Department of Energy by the Jason Committee in 1979, and perhaps the most well-known of the three, the so-called Charney Report, published in 1979 by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. The result of all of these different studies led the National Academy of Sciences to issue a press release in 1979 in conjunction with the Charney Report. And here's what scientists had to say about this issue in 1979. A plethora of studies from diverse sources indicates a consensus that climate changes will result from man's combustion of fossil fuels and changes in land use. So again, we see here, skeptics often like to say, oh, science isn't about consensus. Science is about heroic individuals going against the consensus. But actually, science is about consensus. And here we see scientists themselves using consensus, it's their term, to describe their own expert judgment based on what they have learned from the work that they have done. We've also heard skeptics and contrarians claim that we've overemphasized the issue of fossil fuels, that scientists have not paid attention to land use changes, but that's not true either. Land use changes have been on the agenda at least since the 1970s. Scientists early on recognized that land use changes, particularly deforestation, could also contribute to global warming, but we also know that the dominant driver is the burning of fossil fuels. So we see from this history that there was a consensus in 1979, but it's a consensus about a prediction, a consensus about what is expected to occur in the future, that global warming would happen. It was also a consensus that it was not a small concern. Are you waiting to give me a different microphone? Okay. Is that better? Does that make a difference? Yeah? Okay, all right. It's going to be, now I have to use both hands. Okay, I think I can do that. So in the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, I found this in the archives, an argument about why this mattered, why this was not just a scientific issue, but was also a policy issue. And they wrote, the close linkage between man's welfare and the climatic regime within which the society has evolved suggests that such climatic changes would have profound impacts on human society. So we see scientists trying to communicate, not in a hysterical way, not in an alarmist way, but in a serious way, the possibility of serious, profound, even profound impacts. The big question, however, to which scientists did not yet have an answer, was when. When would these changes be expected to occur? Most scientists who were working at this time thought the changes would probably not be detectable until the year 2000. In fact, one of the scientists I interviewed who was part of the briefing the Carter administration on this issue in the 1970s, tells an anecdote about going to the Carter White House and explaining the scientific work, and one of the officials at the White House saying, well, maybe 40 years, and the White House official says, come back in 39. So sometimes scientists are surprised by their own result. And that's what happened next, because scientists were in fact surprised when only 6 years later, not 39 years later, but 6 years later, NASA climate modeler Jim Hansen and his team published an article, actually published a series of articles, in which they concluded that the climate signal, that observable changes had in fact already occurred. Hansen testified to this in the US Congress in 1988, in which he declared that he was 99% certain that climate change was now detectable. And it was this emerging and frankly disturbing consensus that climate change might in fact be faster than scientists had anticipated that led in part to the creation of the IPCC in the first place in 1988. Again, we've heard a lot of criticism of the IPCC, a lot of fussing about a typo, about a glacier, a lot of criticism about what kind of organization this is, but nobody seems to ever stop to ask, well, why was the IPCC even created in 1988? And the answer is because scientists already knew then that this was likely to be a serious matter for public concern. But while this emerging scientific consensus led to the creation of the IPCC and many other things as well, it also led to something entirely different. It led to the emergence of a politically motivated campaign to cast doubt on the science, to challenge the consensus, and to say that we didn't, in fact, know whether or not climate change was happening. This politically motivated campaign focused on the claim that the science was unsettled, that there was no consensus, and therefore that it would be premature for governments to act, governments or individuals or businesses to act to do anything about it. As a historian, I'm interested in origins, and one of the amazing things about this story that Eric Conway and I discovered was that the origins of this claim can be tracked back to a very, very small group of people. Now today, as you all know, doubt about climate science, about its reliability, about its reality, has been promoted in many different quarters, both in the United States and Canada. But one of the most important sources of this challenge, of this claim that the science isn't really settled, for a long period of time, in fact, going back to 1988, going back to this very moment when the consensus, the scientific consensus first emerged, is the George C. Marshall Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C. For more than 2 decades, the Marshall Institute has denied the reality of global warming or insisted that if there is warming, it's not caused by human activities. So where did the Marshall Institute come from? And why do they promote doubt about climate science? The Marshall Institute was founded by 3 men, all physicists, all prominent, distinguished, brilliant physicists who had made their careers in the Cold War working on Cold War weapons and rocketry programs. On the left, the founder of the Marshall Institute, Robert Jastrow, an astrophysicist and head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, who had worked extensively on the early NASA rocketry programs, including the Apollo program. On the right, William Nirenberg, a nuclear physicist who was a longtime director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where he supervised many Navy-sponsored programs related to submarine-launched ballistic missiles, mine-sweeping, sonar, and other military applications of oceanography. And in the center, Friedrich Seitz, the first chairman of the board of the Marshall Institute, also a physicist, wrote the leading textbook in solid-state physics in the mid-part of the century, worked with Eugene Wigner, often considered to be one of the founders of the atomic bomb, and also a one-time president of the National Academy of Sciences and president of the Rockefeller University. So all 3 very distinguished, all very prominent, all physicists who had built their careers in the Cold War. In the 1980s, 2 of the 3 were now retired, the 3rd was on the verge of retirement, and at this time they found themselves working together on an advisory panel to the Reagan administration on the question of Reagan's proposed Strategic Defense Initiative, or otherwise known as Star Wars. In 1984, these 3 men created the Marshall Institute to defend strategic defense against scientist opposition, and to promote the continuing importance of science and technology in national defense, in part by insisting on the reality of Soviet strength and the reality of U.S. weakness, or the alleged reality of U.S. weakness. From 1984 to 1989, they published numerous articles arguing this point. I don't have time to go into all of them in detail, but this is my favorite one, published in the National Review, America Has 5 Years Left. That was in 1987. Now, at the time, Friedrich Seitz had retired from the Rockefeller University, and he had taken on one last job, and that was working as a consultant to the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Corporation. As many of you know, and has been well documented by the work of some of my colleagues like Robert Proctor and Alan Brandt, the principal strategy that the tobacco industry used to defend tobacco against scientific evidence of its harms was doubt-mongering, to insist that the science was unsettled and that therefore it would be premature for governments to act to control tobacco use. Well, in 1989, these two strands of the story merged. The Cold War came to an end. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union was not as strong as Jastrow and the others had alleged, but in fact began to disintegrate. So you might have thought that these Cold Warriors would be happy, that they would be pleased that their life's work had had the result, the conclusion that they had always hoped for. But they weren't happy. Instead, they found a new enemy. And that new enemy was what they called environmental extremism, what they considered to be the exaggeration of environmental threats by people with a left-wing political agenda. And using the strategy that Seitz had learned working with the tobacco industry, they applied the doubt-mongering strategy, the tobacco strategy, to insist that the science was unsettled. Doubt is our product, ran the infamous memo written by one tobacco industry executive in 1969, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. Well, if doubt was their product, these scientists supplied it. One of the insights that the tobacco industry realized early on was that if tobacco executives got up and said, well, we're not really persuaded by the science, most of us would not find that very credible. Certainly journalists would not find that credible. But if scientists said it, if prominent, famous, distinguished scientists said it, if a president of the US National Academy of Sciences said it, well, that was quite a different matter. So a key part of the tobacco strategy was recruiting prominent scientists to supply the doubt. And in our book, then, we tell the story of how these scientists supplied doubt, not just about global warming, but a whole host of issues in which, well, I'll tell you in a minute what connects all these issues, but a whole host of public health and environmental issues, including the harms of tobacco, both direct and secondhand, the threat of nuclear winter, the reality of acid rain, the severity and causes of the ozone hole, the human causes of global warming, and most recently in a kind of revisionist attack on older science about the harms of the pesticide DDT. The physicists in this story cast doubt on all of these issues, on the science related to all of these issues. And in every single case, in case after case after case, over the course of more than 3 decades, insisted that the science was too uncertain to provide a robust basis for public policy. Now, to learn how they did it, you'll have to read the book, which is on sale for only $22.50. What I'd like to focus on tonight is what I think is the most interesting, the most vexing, and in some ways the most important part of the story in terms of knowing how to respond. And I think this is the most important part for the scientists in the audience. Sometimes scientists say to me, well, why do I need to know history? And I think our book answers that question, because if you don't understand the character of the opposition, then the remedies you will bring to bear will be ineffective. But if you do understand the character of the opposition, then you're in a much better position to think about ways of addressing it. So I want to talk then for the rest of the evening about why they did it, why distinguished scientists would attack the work of their own colleagues, and then why it gained so much traction, particularly on the conservative or right-wing side of the American political spectrum. And that, I think, also helps to explain why this issue is now so politicized. So the short answer is the role of ideology, and specifically the role of neoliberalism in the format that George Soros has called free market fundamentalism. So what is modern neoliberalism? Well, modern neoliberalism is a set of beliefs focused on the power of deregulation to generate economic growth and prosperity, and releasing the so-called magic of the marketplace. It came to prominence in the early 1980s under Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the United States, but it wasn't just conservatives, Tories, and Republicans. It was also promoted throughout the 1990s as part of the so-called Washington Consensus, led by US Democratic leader President Bill Clinton and UK Labour leader Tony Blair. It was also promoted over the course of more than 3 decades by the chairman, the powerful chairman of the US Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan. And throughout the 1990s and 2000s, I would say actually right up to the global financial crisis, in the United States and throughout much of Europe, Canada, Australia as well, there was a bipartisan consensus on the virtues of deregulation. Its intellectual roots can be found in the work of 2 key thinkers, Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. Many of you have probably heard of Milton Friedman, the Chicago School economist, whose seminal work was a book published in 1962 during the coldest moment of the Cold War, entitled Capitalism and Freedom. In this book, Friedman argued what is a kind of central point for many conservatives in the United States and elsewhere, namely that civic freedom and economic freedom, or free markets, are inextricably linked. And that if you allow the government to encroach on the freedom of free markets, it's only a matter of time before it will encroach on civil, political, religious, and social liberties as well, and we're on the slippery slope to tyranny. Friedman was inspired in turn by the work of Friedrich Hayek, who's the Austrian economist who's considered to be one of the founders of modern neoliberalism. In his 1944 work, Road to Serfdom, Hayek argued that once the government begins to control the economy, it's only a matter of time before we are on the road to serfdom. Now, the contrarians in our story took this argument one step further, arguing that environmentalism was the road to serfdom because it was the slippery slope to socialism, communism, tyranny. Why? Well, because environmentalists generally argued for government regulation, some kind of government intervention in the marketplace. And they argued then that from the regulation of acid rain or secondhand smoke, it was only a small step towards government control more generally. So today, acid rain, tomorrow, the Bill of Rights. This idea is articulated in many contrarian writings, but perhaps most clearly by a fourth scientist who joined the cause in the 1980s, this man, S. Fred Singer. Singer's biography was remarkably similar to the other three. He was also a physicist, also a Cold War physicist. In fact, he was the proverbial rocket scientist. He was involved in campaigns to challenge the evidence of acid rain, global warming, and the ozone hole. And like Frederick Seitz, Fred Singer also worked for the tobacco industry. In the early 1990s, when the debate about secondhand smoke began to heat up, bad metaphor, bad pun, Singer worked with the Philip Morris Tobacco Company to attack the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency over the issue of secondhand smoke. In 1993, he published a report co-authored with Kent Jeffries, a lawyer for the Cato Institute, called EPA and the Science of Environmental Tobacco Smoke. Now, this report is very interesting because it also is an example of a larger pattern we discuss in the book. The report was published by a think tank called the Alexis de Tocqueville Institute. Alexis de Tocqueville, of course, being the famous author of Democracy in America. And the de Tocqueville Institute appears to be independent, but in fact, if you track the money trail, you find that the funding for this came from the Tobacco Institute. So the tobacco industry was putting money into this supposedly independent research institute called the Tobacco Institute. Tobacco Institute then is funding money into a supposedly independent think tank, the Alexis de Tocqueville Institute, which then launches an attack on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So what was the nature of this attack? Why was the EPA coming under attack from the tobacco industry? Well, the EPA had declared that secondhand smoke was a Class A or proven carcinogen. And this result had been affirmed by the U.S. Surgeon General. The evidence was supported by diverse, independent, peer-reviewed studies in the United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, Germany, and elsewhere. So why would a rocket scientist challenge this scientific evidence? Indeed, why would any scientist challenge it? Well, Fred Singer answered that question. He wrote, "If we do not carefully delineate the government's role in regulating dangers, there is essentially no limit to how much government can ultimately control our lives." So there it is, today smoking, tomorrow the Bill of Rights. Friedrich Seitz made a similar point when he attacked the IPCC in the Wall Street Journal after the release of the second assessment report of the IPCC. And it's an interesting pattern that many of these attacks in the science are published in business-oriented journals like the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, or Fortune, where they find a kind of sympathetic audience among people who, for their own reasons, maybe just strictly business reasons, might be resistant to the idea of more government regulation. So Seitz said, IPCC reports are often called the consensus view, but if they lead to carbon taxes and restraints on economic growth, they will have a major and almost certainly destructive impact on the economies of the world. So here we have Seitz, who's a physicist, not an economist, not a policy man, but making this very strong allegation that if we have a carbon tax, it's going to have a destructive impact on the economy, which you guys can speak to. And Frank Luntz, who we started this talk with, made a similar point when he was attacking climate science in the Wall Street Journal in 2003 before his conversion. He wrote, "Once Republicans concede that greenhouse gases must be controlled, it will only be a matter of time before they end up endorsing more economically damaging regulation." So again, there it is, the slippery slope. And I was going to add one more slide, and I forgot to do it, so you know I'm at least updating my talk. But just 2 weeks ago, when Mitt Romney announced his candidacy for the Republican nomination for President of the United States, and he said, he's the only major Republican candidate who has said this, he said he accepted the scientific evidence that climate change was happening and was probably caused, at least in part, by people. He was attacked by Newt Gingrich, who said, this is just the latest left-wing liberal attempt to control our lives. So this idea of control, this idea of regulation, constraint, we see this throughout their writings. Indeed, throughout their writings, contrarians assert that environmentalists, and by implication scientists working on environmental questions, have a hidden agenda. And that hidden agenda, they allege, is anti-business, anti-free market, and anti-technology. Indeed, the allegation is often made that environmentalists are actually socialists and communists in disguise. So they accuse environmentalists of being watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. That's why I wear brown. George Will, the commentator for the Washington Post in the United States, has called environmentalism a green tree with red roots. And Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, who has threatened to indict climate scientists for conspiracy to lie to Congress, has accused them of being part of the left-wing conspiracy to bring down global capitalism, to which I reply that the left should be so organized. So Fred Singer has picked up this theme many, many times. Back in 1989, when he was first attacking the science related to the ozone hole, he wrote, "And then there are probably those with hidden agendas of their own, not just to save the environment, but to change our economic system. Some of these coercive utopians are socialists, some are technology-hating Luddites, most have a great desire to regulate on as large a scale as possible." And then later in 1991, he returned to this theme, writing about the hidden agenda. "More dangerous are those who have a hidden political agenda, most often oriented against business, the free market, and the capitalistic system. Of course, after the collapse of socialism, it is no longer fashionable to argue for state ownership of industrial concerns. The alternative is to control private firms by regulating every step of the manufacturing process." So what we see then in all of these writings is that this debate was not about the science. The science had been settled for a long time. The science of acid rain, the science of ozone hole, the science of the dangers of tobacco, and now today the science of global warming. Scientifically, these are all old news. These are all issues that scientists had understood, the scientific questions, the physics and the chemistry and the earth science, for a long time. But what these debates were really about were about governance, and more specifically about the role of regulation in the economy. The debate was driven by an ideological commitment to laissez-faire economics, as articulated by Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, the Milton Friedman belief in the inextricable link between political and economic freedom, and by a hostility to regulation as a form of creeping communism, a hostility that was born and nurtured in the Cold War. Now, of course, this story has many ironies, but I think the one that strikes me the most is about the George Will allegation that environmentalism is a green tree with red roots, because that's simply incorrect. We know a lot about the history of the environmental movement in the United States and Canada. There have been many good books written about this. And the origins of the U.S. environmental movement, and in Canada as well, are not to be found in left-wing politics, not to be found in the socialist movement, the international workers of the world, the labor movement, or any of the major left-wing movements of the 1910s and 20s and aughts, but actually in the United States, in the progressive republicanism of Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, and of course that famous communist John D. Rockefeller. From the 1920s to the 1960s, there was a bipartisan consensus in the United States over the importance of wilderness and environmental protection. So much so that when the Wilderness Act of 1964 designated over 9 million acres of American lands as areas where man is a visitor and does not remain, it passed the U.S. Senate by a vote of 73 to 12, and the House of Representatives by a vote of 373 to 1. In the 1970s, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which has been a model for similar agencies around the globe, was created by the Republican President Richard Nixon, who signed into law the key pieces of legislation that remain the framework, the backbone of environmental protection in the United States today. But things began to change in the 1980s. They began to change when scientific evidence began to reveal serious problems like acid rain, the ozone hole, and global warming. Problems that didn't seem to be able to be solved by just local action or individuals operating on their own accord. Problems that seemed to demand government intervention in the marketplace. Indeed, problems that seemed to demand regulation of some form. And in what historians would call a contingency, or ordinary people would call bad luck, these scientific issues emerged. The scientific evidence, the scientific consensus on these issues emerged just at the very time that the Reagan administration in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom were arguing for less government and less regulation, exactly as advocated by Milton Friedman, in the time when Ronald Reagan was famously saying that government's not the solution, it's the problem. And this, I would argue, historically, put the Reagan administration, and later the entire neoliberal consensus, on a collision course with science, on a collision course with the future of the planet. Now, Ronald Reagan may have had a point. Government regulation is not the solution to every problem, and some environmentalists are socialists. Moreover, the cutting edge of science is always somewhat unsettled. There's always uncertainty in any live science. There's always room for reasonable doubt. But the question becomes for us as citizens, for politicians, and for public policy, what's reasonable? At what point does doubt no longer become reasonable, but becomes obstruction? And this is again where history can be helpful. Because history clearly shows that the rejection of the scientific evidence regarding DDT, acid rain, the ozone hole, and secondhand smoke was not based on reasonable scientific doubt. Indeed, it wasn't based on scientific doubt at all. None of the doubt that was raised in these stories was actually raised by scientists working on the questions. All of it was raised by scientists driven by a free market political agenda. And in fact, the very thing they accuse their opponents of, in fact, being the thing that they themselves are doing. It was based on the desire to avoid government regulation of the products and activities that had created the problems. Moreover, history also shows that DDT, nuclear winter, acid rain, the ozone hole, and the harms of tobacco were all real problems needing real solutions. And indeed, if we look back historically, we see it's that the scientists who got it right and the merchants of doubt who got it wrong. Finally, and perhaps most important, as we move forward towards addressing the problem of global warming, towards finding those solutions, history also shows us that free market capitalism, like any human institution, has its limits. To believe that climate change is real is not to say that we have to change the entire economic system, but it is to say that we have to recognize the problem of negative externalities. This is a term that economists have developed to describe costs that accrue to people or the environment or other species who did not reap the benefits of the activities that generated those goods and services. Costs that are not reflected in the market price. And environmental damage is the textbook case of a negative externality, something that even Milton Friedman recognized. And this then is the common thread that unites the otherwise diverse science challenged by the merchants of doubt. In every case, they involve negative externalities, and in every case, they involved market failures. Failure of the marketplace to account for the real harms and damages that were taking place. They were all examples of behaviors that generated large external costs, large negative externalities, and therefore provided a potential warrant for government intervention in the marketplace. Indeed, Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank, in his report known as the Stern Report, has called anthropogenic global warming the greatest and widest-ranging market failure ever seen. Yes, my talk wants to stay on this argument about market failure. Okay, so there we go. So I think when we put it in this light, when we think about this problem of negative externalities of market failure, it then becomes easier to understand the politicization of this issue. Easier to understand then, and not surprising, in fact, that environmentalist Europeans and those on the left of the political spectrum have been quick to accept the reality of these problems, because people who have these orientations are not averse to considering the fact that there could be market failures. In contrast, conservatives, libertarians, and many American citizens have been rather slow to accept the evidence. The American judge Richard Posner has pointed out that behavior that generates large external costs provides an apt occasion for government regulation. So how we feel about regulation, how we feel about the government, about governance in general, will affect how we feel about that behavior, whether it's smoking or burning fossil fuels. We are all more likely to accept evidence consistent with our pre-existing worldview. But as Posner points out, a rational decision maker starts with a prior probability, but adjusts that probability as new evidence comes to his attention. History tells us that scientists have known for a very long time that global warming from burning fossil fuels could occur. And for more than 20 years now, evidence has been mounting that it is indeed occurring. Evidence that our scientists now tell us is unequivocal. And of course, the other deep irony running through this whole story is that the energy sector is not a free market, not even close. Indeed, the World Bank recently published a report in conjunction with the Institute for Energy Analysis, OECD, and OPEC, in which they calculated the value of global subsidies to the fossil fuel industry worldwide and placed the value of that figure at $700 billion a year in subsidies to fossil fuel production. $700 billion. We hear a lot about French agricultural subsidies and agricultural subsidies worldwide. Well, agricultural subsidies are $400 billion, so nearly twice as much in fossil fuel subsidies. And here's my favorite comparison. TARP, the Troubled Asset Recovery Program, also known as the bank bailout in the United States, cost the US taxpayers $700 billion, the same amount as we subsidize the fossil fuel industry every year. Global subsidies to the fossil fuel industry are TARP every single year. So every year, we are bailing out the world's fossil fuel industry. Why are we doing that? Interesting question. So to conclude, the Industrial Revolution brought the developed world 150 years of unprecedented prosperity, a free lunch of historic proportions. And by and large, that was a good thing. Those of us who live in the developed, industrialized, prosperous world live in comfort and with food that our ancestors 300 years ago could not have imagined. So by and large, the prosperity that we have bought by tapping the energy in fossil fuels has been a good thing for those of us who have participated in it. But it wasn't actually free. The bill is global warming, and that is a bill that has now come due. And as Kim Stanley Robinson has pointed out, the invisible hand never picks up the check. Thank you very much.
Professor Oreskes will be delighted to take questions, but please use the microphones on both sides because we are webcasting the presentation tonight. The online people will need to hear you.
As an old environmental activist, I'm interested in what you consider the solutions to the immediate problems every country is now facing, and how we can bring some of these people who've brought this on us to justice. So I would be interested to hear your views on that. A native friend of mine calls this time in history Carmageddon, or payback time.
Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting question. I get asked that a lot. And so I believe in both carrots and sticks. So I think the most important, the most immediate thing is to put a price on carbon, to have a clear market signal. And it's one of the reasons I accepted this invitation to come. This is my second visit to BC in the last 13 months. The fact that you have a carbon tax here and you are implementing it and trying to put a price on carbon is hugely important, and it's a model for people elsewhere. So I hope you guys won't flinch and we'll continue to push forward on that. We have to have a price on carbon. The the price of burning fossil fuels has to realistically reflect the cost of doing that business. And right now it doesn't in most places in the world. So I think that's the most important thing. But I also do believe in sticks. And I think one of the interesting parts of this history that I've talked about elsewhere is to think about what brought the tobacco industry under control in the United States. It's still not under control globally. But in the United States, litigation was a very important part of changing the cultural narrative about tobacco, of alerting people to the fraud that the tobacco industry had perpetrated on the American people, and to the true hazards and the extent of the scientific evidence of the hazards of tobacco, which was not just lung cancer, but I mean, the World Health Organization has a list of all of the diseases that have now been conclusively linked to tobacco, and it's more than 200 different diseases. I mean, it's a staggering array of public health affliction. So I do think litigation is quite important, and I am currently working with some colleagues thinking about the question of how litigation could be brought to bear to assist in this problem. And if anybody has any ideas on that, or if there are any law professors in the audience, please send me an email, because I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Yes, last week we heard that ocean scientists throughout the world have declared that the ocean is dying. And a great cause of that is global warming and greenhouse gas. It occurred to me that there at the same time was a great deal of energy being put on our hockey team here losing the Stanley Cup, and that created a great amount of energy and interest. However, the fact that the ocean is dying seemed to pass without much comment. And I'm wondering what it is that needs to happen before we can at least get the amount of energy that the hockey team gets.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting problem, and I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know that I can answer that question. I don't think it's a good idea to criticize hockey in Canada. So let me just say that, you know, people need to have good news in their lives. People need to have different things to pay attention to. And it is true that global warming is a bad news story, and people do get burnt out on bad news. And it is one of the challenges of this issue, is how to communicate about it in a way that conveys the seriousness of the problem but doesn't depress people so much that they become so disheartened that they give up. So I think the oceans, it is extremely important to talk about the oceans, and I in fact got involved in this initially because of work I was doing on the history of oceanography, which is how I came to know about Roger Revelle and Hans Suess and Dave Keeling and all of those scientists. It's extremely important to talk about the oceans, though, because there's a tendency for some people to dismiss climate change as, oh, it's not that big a deal, so things get a little warmer, big deal, I like warm weather, you know, that's good. If it gets a little drier in Victoria, that's probably good too, you know. I think it is impossible to dismiss the impacts on the ocean because of the potential impacts on the base of the food chain. And you know, skeptics and contrarians like to accuse scientists and environmentalists and historians of being alarmists, but when you read about what is going on in the ocean, and you read about ocean acidification and the potential impact that that can have on plankton that represent the base of the food chain, well, I think that is, in fact, rather alarming. So I do think it's very important for us to be talking about the oceans, and also to point out that some of the geoengineering solutions that are sometimes talked about for climate change will not stop the problem of ocean acidification. So thank you for raising that.
At the beginning, you said that scientists shouldn't assume that communicating as they do, they're going to have an impact, and that one in some way has to take into account what you've been talking about today. So what have you recommended to scientists to change their approach? Do you, for instance, advocate that if you happen to have good, solid conservative credentials and Republican membership, that you should always emphasize those at the beginning so that people will be more prepared for your scientific messages? And what else?
Yeah. I do think that. I do think that if you have conservative credentials, if you're a member of a faith-based community, if you worked in the mining industry as I did, that it is useful to mention these things because it helps to disarm people's assumptions about this kind of array of things, anti-business, anti-technology, Luddite, socialist. To disarm that and to point out, to kind of break through people's stereotypes can be helpful in creating conversations, at least with some people in some cases. So if you have the opportunity to do that, I think that is important. And if you have the opportunity to speak to people in the business community, the Rotary clubs, or faith-based communities, I think it's extremely important to take advantage of those opportunities. Eric Conway and I made a pledge when we finished this book that if we got invited to any red state in the country, we would go, and now we have to live up to it. So, so we've been to Kansas, Oklahoma, Utah, Nevada, but it is really important not just to preach the choir. I also think one of the things that's really important in this story is that it also shows, though, that you should not debate. That if you, and I've had this conversation with some scientists who have been a little perplexed and maybe even disturbed by my saying this, but I think it's a very important thing to understand. The whole crux of the doubt-mongering strategy is to say that there's still a debate, to say that scientists don't agree. So if you agree to a debate, then you've proved their point. And it does not matter what you say. You could make the most compelling arguments in the world. You could have the most fantastic graphics. But you're up there saying, yes, there is climate change. We know it. And then someone else is there saying, no, there isn't. We still don't know. They win. So the debate format is, in my opinion, never productive for a climate scientist, ever. I think there are many other ways to get out and communicate. There are many ways you can get your message across. I think it's extremely important for scientists to be out and about communicating, but not debating. And just one other thing, but that said, I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying that scientists shouldn't get out there and talk. They do. It's extremely important. And one of the lessons I think that we draw from the tobacco experience and acid rain and the ozone hole and all these other things, the science by itself was not sufficient to create the public policy, but it was absolutely necessary. Without the science, we would not have even really known what these issues were. We would not have known what the causes were. So the science is crucial, and it is extremely important for scientists who are the true experts on these issues to get out and explain to the public as much as possible what we know, how we know it, and how long we have known it. Because that's the other thing that comes up. When I give this talk, very often people in the audience will come up to me afterwards and say, I had no idea the science was that old. And in science we don't often think about old news as being good because we're always interested in the cutting edge, but actually for most people, knowing that the science is old is effectively the same as saying that the science is secure and stable and established. And so that's a very, very important message. So it's important for scientists not just to talk about the latest results, not to talk about just the stuff that we're still arguing about, although there's a place for that, but to be very clear about the things that have been established for quite some time.
For a bit longer.
Okay.
Well, I was going to alter.
Okay, I really was interested in your connections with the tobacco companies because they wrote the playbook on how to convince the public that regulations were bad. And they didn't just use doubt. They also tried to convince the public that by having regulations restricting smoking was going against individual human liberty. But basically, they did the so-called values that they talked about were always, if you track the money, that's where it all began. And I was interested that you haven't talked a lot tonight about the financial backing for, that sort of promulgates and pushes these values. Because I don't think it's just, we don't like the free market economy. There is real money behind this, and there is conflict of interest, and there are people that are profiting by this. There may be sincere people, but the sort of the spokespeople, the thought leaders of this movement, it's always about the money.
Okay, I agree with everything you said except the very last thing. I don't think that's right about the thought leaders. I think that's the crucial point that it is important to understand. That actually the thought leaders, in this case, were the founders of the Marshall Institute. And it was not about money for them. It was about defending freedom as they understood it. And I do think that's crucial to understand, because I think that if you don't understand that, then you can't explain why these people did what they did. Now, you're absolutely right, money plays a role, and in the book we do talk in the book about some of those aspects. There are some other people who have done more research on the money trail. Richard Littlemore in Vancouver is working on this right now. He and Jim Hogan have done work on this. Chris Mooney, Ross Gelbspan. So there are people who had done that. So some of that work's been done already. We didn't feel we had to repeat it, but we do cite it in the book. But you're absolutely right. I mean, part of the reason that this campaign worked worked was because it played into certain American anxieties born in the Cold War. Part of the reason it worked was because these people seemed to be credible because they actually were scientists of a certain type. Part of the reason it worked was because they had access to power. In the book, we have a whole discussion about the access to power. But of course, part of the reason it worked was because they also became incredibly well-funded. And so in the book, we explain how over time then, the fossil fuel industries and other regulated industries begin to pump money into these think tanks. And it gets too boring for me to say the same thing over and over again, so I sometimes vary the talk a little. So I do have some slides, a different version of this talk, where I get into a little bit more the whole network of think tanks. And there's now a laundry list. Eric and I have counted more than 25 different think tanks who have been involved in climate change denial, almost all of whom do get money from either the fossil fuel industry, the tobacco industry, or other regulated or potentially regulated industries. So you're absolutely right about that.
Thank you.
So thanks for the talk. It was great. A lot of great points. Many questions, of course, that I have. I'm going to forget a couple of things, but I'll make it quick.
You have to read the book. All the answers are in the book. No, just kidding.
So there was a fellow up there that you said he then changed his mind. I can't remember his name.
Luntz, Frank Luntz. Yeah.
Has that had any impact?
No, not really. I mean, the thing that's really weird, it's such a complicated story because it did look for a while like it was going to have impact. There was a period shortly after the Schwarzenegger initiative where a number of leading Republicans in the United States, including Luntz, including Newt Gingrich, did change their position and said, we kind of get it that this is real. Then with the election of Barack Obama, there was a backlash against that. And so you saw the right wing in the United States kind of moving away from it. And now Newt Gingrich completely ignores what he said a few years ago, and suddenly he's back on the thing that this is a liberal conspiracy to control our lives. So it's a very difficult political situation in the United States today, because even though opinion polls show that the majority of American people do believe that climate change is underway and do believe that human activity is a driver, there are very few leaders in the Republican Party who are prepared to say that in public. And when they do, they get lambasted.
Can we play their game where there has to be a researcher out there that is working on information to say that control of the population will go down, so there's not that risk of freedom, limits of freedom, and there's more jobs or capabilities of new industries. Is there somebody quantifying that? I'll just ask that question, but then I'll also say the TARP, the 800 or 700
billion.
700 billion. Yeah. As a joke, we're giving that funding to them because they know it's a dying industry. So,
well, that could be the case. Yeah, sure. There are a lot of people working on this, and this isn't my specialty. There are certainly lots of people working on technological solutions, innovative financing, incentives, and certainly I think talking about the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry is really important, because I think there are many people who, well, look, it's a really, really complicated question what the relationship is between political freedom and the economic system we live in. And if I had more time, I could do a whole separate lecture on that question. But to worry about government intrusion on personal liberty is not a ridiculous thing. So I think the important thing to point out is that energy is not a free market. We have this massive subsidies to the fossil fuel industries. Why are we doing that, given how incredibly profitable these companies are, and given that we know that fossil fuels are the fuels of the 19th century? So I do think that there are ways that you can use this to begin to think about other ways of talking about the issue that will resonate, for some people, other than just giving them more and more and more scientific data.
Hi, Naomi. Guy Dauncer here. I want to thank you so much for doing all this depth of research and digging into these roots that help us understand this thing a lot better. I got two questions, one small and quirky and one larger and quirky. The quirky one is you mentioned going back to George Hayek, who was Milton Friedman's inspiration,
Hayek, yeah.
Who wrote his book about the road to serfdom in 1944 as an Austrian. Well, Austrians were up to something in 1944. And I wondered if you had any sense of what he was up to and where did he stand on Nazism? So that's the first question. The second question is going into the psychology of this fear of government regulation. There's a well-known denier here in Victoria who's quite prominent, who, apart from his climate denial, threw a total hissy fit when a bicycle lane was put in on Fort Street. They were taking away the road from the cars, and he wrote a letter at the Times Colonist, which is classic 4-year-old tantrum. And do you know any social psychology work that actually ties this phobic fear of regulation, apart from a rational fear of regulation, this phobic fear of regulation to this fear that mummy's going to control me, daddy's going to control me, they've never properly worked through their childhood tantrum fits or something. There's something else going on here because it's not rational. Any insights?
I don't really, because I'm not a psychologist. Just so quickly on the first one, Hayek, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hayek was very, very concerned about why Austrians had turned to fascism. So it's totally tied up with the whole history of the Nazi period and then the Cold War. And it's about totalitarianism, essentially. And so Hayek thought that the failures of attempts at socialism in the 20s and 30s had actually caused a reaction and made people kind of crave a more authoritarian regime that would make the trains run on time. So that was partly why he was so anti-socialist, because he saw fascism as a kind of reaction against the failures of socialism. And I think this whole story is actually quite deeply tied up with a whole set of 20th century anxieties about control, about totalitarianism, about the rise of fascism, which we still in some deep ways don't entirely understand, right? So the whole Cold War anxiety, again, it's not crazy, but it becomes exaggerated to the point of being sort of pathological. I'm not a psychologist. There are psychologists beginning to work on this. Steve Lewandowski in West Australia is doing some work on this, so you might look up some of his stuff. I can't really explain the sort of crazy anxiety except to say that there are clearly people for whom this strikes at the heart of identity. And I think you do see this in a lot of the people who throw, as you say, hissy fits. As I said before, global warming is a bad news story. It's saying that we have a serious problem, and it's a serious problem that is right at the root of our economic system, because everything we do is based on tapping the energies in fossil fuels, pretty much. So it's saying that at the core of this amazing edifice of Western prosperity is an Achilles heel. And it's an Achilles heel that all of us participate in. But we have very different reactions to that. And again, this gets back to the whole kind of liberal or right-wing, left-wing divide. Left-wing people who don't like the world as it is anyway embrace that message because they say, see, it was bad all along. This was never sustainable. We shouldn't be living this way. We should be riding our bicycles and drinking out of, reusable water bottles, right? And conservatives or whoever, whatever category you want to use to describe them, people who think that the world we live in is good and the United States is great, they take this as a deep affront that scientists are telling them that they're bad, that the United States is bad, that America's bad, that all the things that we stand for are bad. And I think it's that message about, you're bad, the United States is bad, the way you live is bad. These are messages that a lot of people don't want to accept, and that's understandable. And I think that also helps explain why this whole story, this is kind of an American story, because there isn't a comparable denial movement in France or Switzerland or Sweden or Argentina or Brazil or even India or China, right? So why is this such a particularly U.S. story? Well, let's face it, the United States is the pinnacle of fossil fuel consumption, right? And everybody likes to talk about China. Well, it is true that China has exceeded the United States in per annum production of greenhouse gases just as of a year or two ago, but they still are behind us in per capita. The United States still uses more fossil fuels per capita than any country in the world. We also still are the #1 producer of greenhouse gases cumulatively since the Industrial Revolution. So if you had to say what country in the world is most responsible for this problem, the answer is the United States. What country lives a lifestyle that is most consumptive of energy? The United States. So, we have a problem. And, lots of people don't like to admit they have problems of all kinds. So in that sense, I think there is a kind of obvious psychological answer, which is just this is about admitting a problem. And you know what a hard time men have with that.
We'll take 2 final questions and then we'll be happy to sign books. Sir.
Thanks very much for a very enlightening talk, and it's refreshing to hear someone get to the psychological base, if you wish, and the understanding of how we relate to the issues in general and the broader things and the threats and how we interpret those threats, a threat being to our way of life and change in the environmental aspects of it, the regulatory side of that, meaning a big change in our life, and most of us just aren't ready to accept that. Perhaps a person in our country that's least willing to accept that is our Prime Minister. And I'm wondering, as a historian, if you have paid much attention to different nations and what they have achieved or not achieved, and how they've changed their directions during the whole climate change issue, the global warming issue, and addressing it. As you may or may not be aware, we've just laid off a good chunk of our climate scientists in Canada, just got the layoff notices from the federal, worked in the federal government. They've been muzzled for years, and we have independent university folks and whatnot who are the only spokesmen left anymore. If you work for Environment Canada, you can't say anything. And I'm just wondering if you have looked at Canada in particular and the role that Canada has come to play in the last few years, and it seems to be increasingly playing as a spoiler, if you wish, in negotiations internationally with respect to the renewal of Kyoto as an example, going on to the next stage past Kyoto, and if you have any observations on that for a Canadian audience.
Well, I haven't studied Canada specifically, and honestly, I mean, it's like a lot of historical work. You know, it's hard enough figuring out what's going on in one country, much less trying to figure out all the other countries as well. So, of course, I always take the standard academic cop-out, which is, it's a great question. I hope other people will work on it. But we do know, we certainly came across some materials when we were doing this book about the way this spread out from the United States. There's no question that this whole story began in the United States, but it has spread to Canada, to Australia, to a little bit to Germany, although not as much. It's not really surprising to me that it spread to other English-speaking nations, obviously, and it's not that surprising that it would spread to Canada because, let's face it, lots of bad things spread from the United States to Canada, you know. You have many of the same kinds of issues here. You also live an energy-consumptive lifestyle. You have large resources of fossil fuels, particularly in the tar sands. You're an oil and gas producing nation. So there are lots of reasons why people in Canada would also resist the evidence in similar ways that people in the United States do. And we see the same thing going on in Australia now with the Australian coal industry financing. There's a group there called the Institute for Public Affairs, heavily financed by the Australian coal industry, but they get their materials from the Competitive Enterprise Institute in the United States, who again are a group we talk about in the book, but I didn't have time to talk about tonight.
First of all, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you could give us some insight into where the denial machine might be moving next, like what their playbook would be, what they're going to be focusing on. I mean, for a while, I was looking over the main think tank websites, and it seemed, for instance, the American Enterprise Institute, they had pages that were saying, on the one hand, I think it was the American Enterprise Institute, anthropogenic climate change isn't happening, pretty much. And then on the same website, you'd see pages saying, well, it's happening, it's so important, and what we need to do is geoengineering, but let's not talk about carbon emissions reductions. So I was wondering if you have any idea where their areas of focus are and what they're going to be trying to do over the next few years, if that's changing at all. And thank you.
Well, one of the things they do, which is very clever, is they try everything. And I think actually we could learn a bit from them on that regard. So as you say, they'll say on one page of the website, they'll say there's no climate change. The next page, they'll say, oh, we'll just fix it. So so geoengineering is one big area. So some of these folks, some, not all, but some skeptics and contrarians will say, well, we'll just use technology to fix the problem. And that kind of fits with, there is a sort of pro-technology, technophilic quality about a lot of this stuff. In the book, we call it techno-fideism. There's a kind of faith in the power of technology to solve problems. And this is something that actually Eric Conway and I are quite interested in about, because I do believe that technology will have to play a huge role in this solution if we get there. So then the question becomes, well, how do we get that technology? So American Enterprise, Competitive Enterprise, Cato, they all want to say, oh, but don't worry, because the technologies will develop spontaneously in a free market system so long as the government doesn't interfere. So it becomes a further argument against government involvement. So that's one big area. Second big area is adaptation. Cato Institute is big on adaptation. So that argument, which again is an old one, is, oh, well, yeah, maybe there's a little bit of global warming, but it's no big deal, we'll just adapt to it. People have been adapting to climate change since the start of time. And again, it's a very convenient argument because it means government doesn't have to do anything, we'll just adjust. It neglects the fact of trillions of dollars of infrastructure, that it's right at sea level in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere. I also think it's a very naive argument in terms of what we're actually facing in terms of, heat waves, fires, hurricanes, floods, things like that. I mean, I think, tell the people of Joplin, Missouri, oh, you'll just adapt to climate change. I mean, it's not really clear what that means in the face of some of the challenges that are likely to occur. So that's a big one. And then the really big one in the United States right now is a renewed attack on the Environmental Protection Agency. I mean, if I could get people to read one chapter of our book, it would be chapter 5 on secondhand smoke, because that story is being replayed today almost identically. And again, it's sort of, when all else fails, you attack the EPA, because in the United States, the EPA is the agency that has legal authority to regulate products that do damage, including greenhouse gases. And the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed that in the case of Massachusetts versus EPA. So the ball is now in the court of the EPA to issue a ruling with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. So now there's been a massive remobilization of the forces of denial, darkness, whatever you want to call them. It's getting late, to attack the EPA. And so part of this attack then is to revisit the DDT case. So again, like, how are all these things related? Well, it was the banning of DDT in the United States was one of the first major acts that the United States Environmental Protection Agency took after it was created. So now you launch this big attack, say that DDT was great, it was terrific, we should never have banned it. See, these people are hysterical environmentalists. The EPA is out of control. They use that phrase all the time, out of control. And now they're out of control again, trying to regulate greenhouse gases, which aren't actually even doing anybody any harm anyway. So that's a big one to watch, in my opinion, and to think about how to support the EPA both politically and technically, I think is very important.
It falls to me now to thank our speaker for this evening, and I'd just like to say a few quick things. First of all, she is going to be willing to sign books here for any of you who have not had a chance yet to read the book. It is a marvelous read. It is one of the most exhaustively researched compendia that you will find anywhere. There are pages and pages and pages of notes detailing memoranda that were pulled from dusty boxes in the basement of the House of Congress and so on. It is a great read, beautifully written, and I recommend it. And I'm not taking a commission. But I just think it's such an important message that everyone in this room, everyone in this city, everyone in this country should in fact read it. Because as Naomi has so eloquently said this evening, the debate is not about science. So please join me in thanking her for a marvelous talk.